was a violation of parole. When he was sent to prison on these charges, he only spent a few months there before he was back on the streets. In almost no time at all, though, he racked up the same charges, same violations, going for a personal record, it would seem. In March of 1997, an arrest warrant was issued for Joseph, but naturally, he didn't want to be taken back into custody and returned to the hellish life in prison. True to form, he then decided to steal his then-girlfriend's car to leave Washington in as much of a hurry as he could muster. That same August, though, he was found by officials in Kansas City, Missouri. There, he was finally arrested for violating his parole. He was extradited back to Washington State, where he was then forced to serve out the remainder of his previous 20-year sentence, scheduled for release in the year 2000. Then, in the summer of 2000, Joseph decided to leave Washington, instead headed for North Dakota, Fargo to be specific. Upon his relocation there, he was required to register as a sex offender for his crimes. Mind you, Joseph was not just any common sexual deviant. He was forced to register as a level 3 sex offender. According to criminaljustice.gov, a level 3 sex offender is the highest level of sex offender. They have a, quote, high risk of repeat offenses and a threat to public safety exists, end quote. Any level 3 sex offender, according to the law, must be registered for life. Upon registering, it seemed for a while as if Joseph had become a working and somewhat normal part of society, enrolling in college in the fall semester of 2000 to keep himself busy. Joseph embarked on a computer programming course at North Dakota State University, wherein he proved himself to be an attentive student, even earning a spot on the dean's list. However, the normalcy ended as quickly as it began. For Joseph, once again, he began taking what wasn't his. He molested a 6-year-old boy in 2004 in a school playground in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. In another instance, he also tried molesting an 8-year-old boy as well, though his attempt was unsuccessful. However, his failure didn't stop him from getting taken for the other molestation, and he was charged with the crime in March of 2005. Because of his less active record in the past few years, Joseph was able to be released on a $15,000 bond, but he did not repay the kindness as he skipped out on his bail, never making it to the hearing in question during the time he had been required to appear in court. He was soon another fugitive to the police of the area as he stopped remaining in contact with them after April 11th. A few days later, Joseph decided to rent a vehicle in an attempt to get out of sight as quickly as possible. The red Jeep he rented was never returned to the rental center, and later it was reported stolen. In a desperate look at Joseph, his landlord in Fargo had nothing but decent words about him, saying he was a good tenant until the day he moved out. The landlord visited Joseph's apartment shortly after his departure, wherein she found that he had left his apartment in disarray, with writings on a mirror and desk blotter saying, "Sorry you missed me," and "Without forgiveness, there is only sanity." Though strange, the messages were definitely the work of Joseph, and his sister even recalls him being a very emotional and spiritual rambler at times, talking of religion and purpose, among other things. Due to the state in which his apartment was left, it is believed by many that Joseph was still living in Fargo when he molested the 6-year-old boy in Minnesota, and that when he jumped bail, he up and left Fargo altogether. The very next month, a warrant was issued for Joseph's arrest. Authorities, though, had no clue what atrocities he would commit while on the lam. One family in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, would never be the same once Joseph Duncan came into town. We'll be right back after these short messages. Brenda K. Groene was born on March 3, 1975, to Darlene and Douglas Matthews in Coeur d'Alene. At a young age, she expressed interest in needlepoint, gardening, and cooking hobbies she continued into adulthood. She remained in her hometown her entire life, wanting to raise her children in a safe place. In total, she had 5 children. Her 2 eldest children, Jesse and Vance, lived with their father, Steve Groene, full-time. Her remaining 3 children, Slade, Dylan, and Shasta, lived with her and her boyfriend, Mark Edward McKenzie. Brenda was employed as a waitress and an entrepreneur. She owned and operated a maid business called Made to Order, which was fairly successful. Mark Edward Mackenzie, her live-in boyfriend, was born on June 26, 1968, to parents Ralph and Lee Mackenzie. Mark worked at Spokane Stainless Productions and enjoyed hunting in his spare time. The couple, now in their 30s, still enjoyed some partying, and it was known to many that they recreationally used drugs. The two had been together in 2005 for over 7 years, and Mark eventually found the nerve to pop the question. Brenda, ecstatic, said yes, and the two partiers began planning their biggest party yet. 13-year-old Slade Vincent Groene was born on March 29, 1992, in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. He was a student at Lakes Middle School in Coeur d'Alene. Slade enjoyed hunting, but he also passed the time by playing video games and listening to rap music. His brother, 9-year-old Dylan James Groene, was born on July 16, 1995. Dylan was especially fond of playing football and guitar and being goofy. The youngest of the home, 8-year-old Shasta Groene, was born on November 25, 1996. She loved to paint her nails, listen to pop music, and play with dolls. With a full house and a wedding to plan, mother of 3 Brenda was looking forward to the happy and wholesome future that awaited her family. Little did she know, but it would unfortunately never come to fruition. In the early hours of May 16, 2005, Joseph approached the Groene Mackenzie rural home off Interstate 90 in Wolf Lodge Bay, Idaho, which is east of Coeur d'Alene. He had clearly done his homework, most likely stalking the denizens of the home to be sure that he'd find who he was looking for. He soon broke into the back door of the home, wearing night vision goggles, a mask, a hood, and leather gloves, while everyone in the house was soundly asleep. First, Joseph found Brenda Groene asleep in the living room. He woke her up, and he pointed the sawed-off shotgun he brought with him in her face. He motioned for her to not scream or make any noise, and she complied at gunpoint. Joseph then motioned for her to get up and made her take him to each bedroom of the house. When he saw what he was working with, he then took each family member one by one back to the living room and bound their arms and legs with zip ties and duct tape. After binding each person, Joseph took Dylan and Shasta into the backyard and made them lay down in the grass. It was at this point that Joseph found a household claw hammer and began to start the first of many violent acts against the Groenes. With his 2 desired targets on the ground and helpless, Joseph then took the eldest son, Slade, into the backyard and hit him with the hammer until he stopped moving. Then Joseph took to the home's living room, where Brenda and Mark awaited their own fate. Joseph used his newfound weapon again, dispatching both Brenda and Mark. Only after watching them die did Joseph finally return to the backyard to retrieve his 2 chosen victims, Dylan and Shasta. He grabbed the 2 of them, still bound, and placed them on the floor of a truck, wherein they laid as he drove to a secret location. There, he found the stolen red Jeep, and when he stopped, he got the kids out and placed them inside the stolen vehicle instead, which had stolen plates from Missouri, and unbeknownst to Joseph, had already been reported stolen on May 4th. Meanwhile, back at the Groene homestead, an investigation had already begun. Like most rural towns, neighbors in this small community outside Coeur d'Alene looked out for each other. Robert Hollingsworth, who knew the Groene family well, was no exception. That day, he noticed that the house was rather quiet. The seed of doubt grew into full fright when he approached the home and spotted blood on the door. Robert knocked several times, though no one came to the door. It was then that he contacted the police and reported his concerns. The police arrived at the scene to find a horrific event had taken place, but they realized as well that something else was off. There were 2 family members missing. They discovered that Shasta and Dylan were nowhere to be found, so they began searching the rural land on which the home was built, but found no trace of either child. For neither child did they even find any trace of their blood inside the house. These findings led police to believe that the children were abducted, and since they were clearly in immediate danger, an Amber Alert was issued shortly after. The community was in complete disbelief. There was a complete shift between the Coeur d'Alene that was peaceful and idyllic to the residents and the new community, both panicked and worried that the person who murdered this family would target them next. The dark dealings that took place here had a hold on the town, who knew nothing of the children's whereabouts. There were places that the police thought they might turn in search of answers. The father of the children, Steve in particular, was questioned as a suspect. Brenda and Steve recently argued about custody of the 3 children and communal land. It was a dispute that would easily look like a motive in the right light. However, a day or two after the abduction of Dylan and Shasta, Steve made a public plea in front of news cameras. Investigators noticed a potential red flag in his public plea, as he says, quote, "Please let my children go safely. They had nothing to do with this." End quote. Investigators wondered if Steve knew more than what he'd already let on, and so he was called in again for questioning and agreed to take a polygraph. It was then that authorities found irregularities in Steve's test, and they began to seek warrants to search his home and to collect his electronics. However, despite the arguments he had with the mother of his children and the irregularities in the test, Steve swore up and down that he would never harm Brenda, much less his own children. It was only after a thorough review of the devices, both computer activity and phone records alike, that Steve was eliminated as a suspect, absolved of all suspicion. However, this placed investigators back at square one, so they began looking once more. At the scene of the crime, there had been another person's fingerprint belonging to one Gary Youngwood, who had attended a barbecue at the Groene home a day before the murder. In addition to the finding at their house, there was other information that investigators tried to piece together. Namely, Jesse Groene shared with police that Gary owed his mother over $2,000. The officials attempted to make contact with Gary, but after contacting his probation officer, they discovered that he notified them he was going to be out of Idaho on vacation. His probation officer requested that he return to Coeur d'Alene, where he willingly spoke to police and submitted to a polygraph. After easily having passed his exam, though, Gary was no longer considered a suspect. Regarding other leads in the investigation, not much headway was being made for a while. Many tips poured in, but they mostly led to dead ends. Authorities knew that they had a limited amount of time to rescue both children, as the perpetrator had clearly been violent with the other members of the family. However, the blood evidence showed that Shasta and Dylan had not been injured in the home, which gave considerable hope to investigators. One potential explanation the investigation team had explored since receiving the blood sample identification was the idea that there was more to this crime on the victim's end. Brenda and Mark's blood showed that they had smoked marijuana and smoked meth several hours before the murder. Again, looking into the idea, the authorities tried finding out whether the murders were drug-related, but the disappearance of Dylan and Shasta still baffled them. They were back into the drawing board here, and soon they requested the assistance of the FBI. FBI profilers stepped in, and although they specialized in serial killers and child abductors, they found themselves stumped as well. Meanwhile, Joseph was transporting the children to the campsite in Lolo National Forest near St. Regis, Montana. While at the campsite, Joseph molested both children multiple times. Terrified and in shock, the children had nowhere to run. Unfortunately, though, the abuse and torture they endured that night was only the beginning. A depraved Joseph took Dylan into an abandoned cabin. Then, while in the cabin, Joseph videotaped himself molesting and torturing Dylan. It was after this that he hung Dylan from a wire noose and beat him. After that, he took the video over to little Shasta, who was forced to watch it with him. The trio spent several weeks on the run. With Joseph committing so many unspeakable atrocities, it is believed that he spent the entire 7 weeks on the run in Lolo National Forest, possibly only moving the pair around a few times. On July 2nd, 2005, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, Joseph took Shasta to a Denny's in Coeur d'Alene. The waitress, Amber Dean, was initially oblivious to the little girl and the older gentleman at her table. However, she eventually was concerned that a child was out this early in the morning. In addition, Shasta's demeanor seemed defeated and tired. Clearly, something was amiss. So Amber approached her manager and expressed her concerns. She wondered out loud if this little girl sitting at her table was Shasta Groene. The girl reported missing several weeks prior.